Buenos días, es un gran honor contar con la presencia del profesor Guy Standing de la SOAS, University of London, quien en estos días está visitando y nos está acompañando en el Congreso Colombiano de Estudios de Trabajo que se está realizando en la ciudad de Cali, coorganizado en la Universidad del Valle. Profesor Standing es uno de los gran autores contemporáneos sobre múltiples áreas de investigación. Una de sus más importantes obras trata el tema de precariado y condiciones contemporáneas de capitalismo contemporáneo. Profesor Guy Standing ha escrito más que 20 libros que fueron traducidos en 25 lenguajes, idiomas, y también es uno de los fundadores de una red, Basic Income Earth Network, que promueve una renta básica como un mecanismo de buscar la sociedad más equitativa, más equitativa. Muchas gracias. Professor Standing, it's a great pleasure and honor to have you here with us at the Congress and the Universidad del Valle. I would like to ask you a few questions regarding your research. The first one has to do with the notion of precariat. How has the category of precariat developed since the publication of your first work in this area? In which direction you have taken your research since then?
Yeah, the first book on the precariat was published in 2011, and many things have changed since it was published. At the beginning, I defined the precariat in terms of a new class of people who are experiencing multiple forms of insecurity and were experiencing a loss of the rights of citizenship. And this, I think, has not been appreciated enough by many of the social scientists and commentators in the early phase of the reaction to the book. Many of them focused on the first dimension, that people in the precariat have unstable labor. They are insecure. People have always been insecure. That's not the most important aspect. It's the fact that people in the precariat are losing the rights of citizenship, and the notion of precarity is different from insecurity. Precarity means, literally from the Latin, to obtain by prayer, to be a supplicant. And this, I think, was insufficiently appreciated in the early phase. And the idea of the precariat was resisted by old Marxists who just wanted to keep the idea of a bourgeoisie and a proletariat, or a bourgeoisie and a working class, when in actual fact, the precariat is profoundly different from the old proletariat. And that's one of the reasons why the trade unions have not been able to understand the precariat. And often when I'm giving a talk to precariat students or anything around the world, they get angry when talk of unions, because they don't think the unions understand them. Now, your question is, how has this changed since 2011? I think really what's happened most importantly is that in 2011, people who were in the precariat were often ashamed of being in the precariat. They were failures. Today, they are proud because they know it's a systemic reality in which they're living. And I think that's the biggest single change, but it's had implications for research, and in my follow-up books, I've tried to deal with that.
Thank you. During these few days, we had a number of conversations with different researchers and students working around the issue of work and labor. And the notion of precariat has come up in several panels. And many of those who are participating in the Congress were curious and wanted to ask, how could they apply or develop, or how can they methodologically study precariat? So I wonder if you could share with us a few reflections in that dimension in terms of how to methodologically approximate and explore it in our research?
I think the first thing I would say is if anybody who's working on the concept of the precariat should, first of all, say the precariat has to do many things that it does not want to do, that does not get recognized in the notion of labor. Mm-hmm. They have to do a lot of work that they don't want to do, but work for which they do not get paid. It uses up a lot of their time, and they lose control of time. So if you're working on the precariat, do not just focus on the labor relationship. Focus on how they're using time and how they're being exploited and oppressed in different ways. This multiple dimensions, I think, is vital. And second, I would say, make sure you differentiate the different groups within the precariat. The precariat is not a homogeneous entity. I divide it into three groups. Those with very little education, who tend to listen to populists and are told that yesterday is better than today, and they want yesterday back. This group is very different from the progressives, young students who are educated, and they don't want the past. That was not very good. They want a different emancipatory approach to life. They aren't in favor of capitalism, but they're not in favor of old social democracy either. They're looking for a new, what I call in my books, a politics of paradise, a politics of hope. And they're not finding it. But use that idea of differentiation in your research, because that will lead you to ask the right sort of questions, right sort of concepts, right sort of consciousness, which you must explore the consciousness. And if you're in the precariat, you have a consciousness of relative deprivation. Relative deprivation means you feel deprived relative to other groups, and you feel deprived relative to time. There is no future. I feel deprived of a future. What would the future be if I were to be a philosopher king? What we want to move towards. Now, in other words, what I'm saying is that if you're researching the precariat, first of all, put it in the context of all classes, the fragmentation I describe in my books. Mm-hmm. And second, think of it in terms of consciousness of deprivation and consciousness of aspiration. And this I want to make a very important point, which I do not make sufficiently often. The precariat are not just victims. And don't feel sorry for me, okay? I don't have the false consciousness of wanting a job. That's all my life. Mm-hmm. I have a consciousness of being liberated. Mm-hmm. They're not just victims. They experience insecurities and deprivations, of course, but they also have a certain freedom in the mind. That's the progressive part. So for me, it's a matter of seeing dialectically the evolution of the precariat in the context of global capitalism as it is developing today, with a disgusting development in the United States with Donald Trump and what I call a plutarchy, ruled by the plutocrats, which is a new form of capitalism, which we should be opposed to, but it puts your context for your research. And that I would say to students and to faculty, to us, we must see it in terms of dynamics of change.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. And finally, the last question that I would like to ask is about more related, if you would like to share with us some of your recent work that you've been working recently, or indeed the ideas that you might be having about the next steps. Where would you like to go in terms of your research and work? In which directions?
Yeah, my new book is called Human Capital, The Tragedy of the Education Commons. I asked myself the question, why is it that we have more education, formal education today than at any time in history? And yet, in many countries, large numbers of people are supporting fascists, authoritarians, disgusting liars. And why is that? Misogynists supporting, why should a woman vote for a Donald Trump? Ask yourself that question if we've got more education than ever. And then I said, no, we don't have good education. The education industry has been captured by financial capitalism and converted into preparing people to be more competitive, more egocentric, more narcissistic, and less empathetic. And it's very important for the precariat because those in the precariat who don't have a lot of formal education will be easily led by people who say, we will give you security. But people who do have real education will not support the fascists. And therefore, I think we need to focus much more on rescuing real education as the search for truth, the respect for morality, the respect for empathy. And I think these dimensions are important in understanding the precariat because the commercializers, the commodifiers want the precariat just to focus on earning money, getting a job, spending their money, watching the screens, and don't worry about politics. Okay? They're playing on ignorance, and it is a contrived ignorance. Every educated person should know about their own history. Every educated person should know about nature, know about how we relate to nature. Every educated person should want the commons back. And that, I think, is so important as part of this dialogue. And I always welcome coming to a university like this, because when I interact with the students, as we've just been doing, I feel that they understand that. They understand that. And that, I think, is the hopeful sign. So I would say to professors like you and to the students, we have to open our minds, challenge. And that, at the moment, is an extremely exciting period, but we're facing very strong forces that don't want us to do that, don't want us to use our education to increase our creativity, our subversive thinking. But we must say no, and we have to stand up. And I think that's our function at the moment.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this interview and also for the whole participation, for engaging with students, for your lectures. It's been a very productive and stimulating visit, and we are very grateful. So thank you very much.
Cheers.
And thank you on behalf of the Congreso Colombiano de Estudios de Trabajo y la Universidad del Valle, pues agradecemos profesor Guy Standing por estar acompañando en estos días, por sus charlas, pero también por sus conversaciones con estudiantes, investigadores, investigadoras y todos y todas que están participando en este congreso en estos días.